The radio crackled with static, then nothing. 53 seconds of silence stretched across the tactical frequency, while 12 pairs of eyes watched the ridge line 2 miles south. The Joint Terminal Attack Controller pressed his hand against his headset, repeating the call sign twice more before looking at his captain, with the expression of someone who just watched a ghost walk through a wall. Nobody spoke. The dust hadn't settled from the last mortar impact, and somewhere in the valley below, an entire mechanized infantry company was pinned down by entrenched forces they couldn't see, couldn't flank, and definitely couldn't survive without close air support. The F-16s had burned through their ordnance 30 minutes ago. The Apache gunships were grounded for maintenance. And the A-10 Thunderbolt that had been circling overhead, providing overwatch and hope in equal measure, had just gone silent after reporting catastrophic hydraulic failure and an engine fire that wouldn't quit. The captain scanned the sky through his rifle optic, searching for the telltale silhouette of the Warthog limping away toward safety, toward the distant airfield where mechanics and foam trucks would be waiting. He saw nothing but empty blue and the dark smoke rising from burning vehicles below. The enemy knew it too. You could hear it in the sudden increase of small arms fire, the way their mortars started walking closer to friendly positions, emboldened by the absence of that deep, guttural roar that had kept them cowering in their bunkers for the last 40 minutes. Someone on the line started praying in Spanish. Another soldier chambered a fresh magazine with hands that shook just enough to notice. Then the ridge erupted. Not with explosions, but with sound. That sound, the one that makes enemies reconsider their life choices and friendlies remember why they joined. A 10-second burst from a GAU-8 Avenger autocannon, 30mm rounds chewing through reinforced positions like a chainsaw through kindling, each shell hitting with the authority of a small car traveling at supersonic speed. The A-10 came over the ridge so low its shadow crossed the valley floor before the aircraft did, trailing black smoke from its right engine and something that looked like hydraulic fluid misting behind the left wing. It shouldn't have been flying. It definitely shouldn't have been fighting. But there it was, rolling into another gun run with the kind of controlled aggression that spoke of someone who'd made a decision and wasn't interested in second opinions. The JTAC found his voice first, breathless and crackling through the command net. Hawk 7-1, you are trailing heavy smoke and showing significant damage. Recommend immediate RTB. Acknowledge. 3 seconds of static. Then a voice, calm as Sunday morning, with the faintest edge of something that might have been amusement. Negative, groundhog. Still have trigger time and some opinions about those mortar positions. Stand by for gun run, southeast to northwest, danger close. Mark your pose. The captain lowered his optic and looked at his JTAC, who was already throwing purple smoke and whispering into his radio like he was afraid of breaking whatever spell was keeping that aircraft in the sky. The A-10 came around again, slower this time, visibly struggling against physics and good sense, but lining up with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times and planned to do it 1,000 more. Callsign Hawk 7-1 belonged to Captain Mariana Vaz, though nobody at the forward operating base called her that anymore. They called her Gravedigger, a name she'd earned 6 months into her deployment when she put a Maverick missile through the window of a building that intelligence had sworn was abandoned, only to watch 30 enemy combatants evacuate the structure seconds before impact. Someone had painted a small shovel on her aircraft nose. She'd never asked them to remove it. Mariana was 34, shorter than regulation would prefer for a pilot, and possessed the kind of quiet competence that made loud people nervous. She'd flown helicopters in her first enlistment, transitioned to fixed-wing during the surge years, and accumulated enough combat hours to qualify as either an expert or completely insane depending on who you asked. Her father had been Air Force, her mother Army Logistics. She'd grown up on bases where the sky was always full of something taking off or landing, where the smell of jet fuel was as common as cut grass, and where she'd learned early that you proved yourself through action, not ancestry, The instructors at flight school had doubted her. Too small, they said. Not aggressive enough. She'd graduated second in her class and never mentioned it again. The A-10 suited her in ways the sleek fighters never had. It was ugly, honest, and built to take punishment while delivering worse. It didn't care about looking good. It cared about getting the job done and bringing everyone home. Today, bringing everyone home was becoming complicated. The master caution light had illuminated 47 minutes ago, shortly after she'd made her fourth gun run on the entrenched enemy positions. The right engine had started running hot, then hotter, then had politely suggested through a series of increasingly urgent warnings that it would very much like to not be an engine anymore. She'd pulled power back, adjusted her pattern, and kept working. The hydraulic failure came next, announced by a pressure drop that made her control stick feel like she was flying through mud. Then the fire light, steady and accusatory, telling her what she already knew from the smell of burning oil and the way her airspeed was bleeding off faster than it should. She'd keyed the radio to call in her status, got halfway through the transmission, and watched her entire electrical system hiccup like it was considering retirement. The radio died. The GPS flickered. Her heads-up display became a very expensive paperweight. She'd flown the pattern manually, using visual references and the kind of instinct that comes from repetition drilled down into muscle memory, and brought the aircraft around for another run because the friendlies below were still pinned, and the enemy was still shooting, and that was really all that mattered. Mariana could see them now, the mortars, dug into a tree line with overlapping fields of fire that had turned the valley into a kill box. She adjusted her approach angle, compensated for the sluggish controls, and the way her aircraft wanted to roll left every time she breathed, and put her pipper on target. The trigger felt familiar under her gloved finger, smooth and certain. The cannon roared. 70 rounds downrange in 3 seconds, each one finding dirt or steel or flesh. Below, the company commander watched 3 mortar positions disintegrate into component atoms and concrete dust, then keyed his radio with hands that had stopped shaking. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd just been pulled back from an edge they'd been starring over. Hawk 7-1, Groundhog Actual. That's good effects on target. You just saved 40 lives. Now please, for the love of God, get that bird back to base before you become a statistic. The A-10 climbed, struggling, trailing smoke that was getting darker and thicker with each second. Mariana's right engine was gone now, completely seized, and her left was running on borrowed time and optimism. The hydraulic pressure had dropped to almost nothing, which meant she was controlling 11 tons of titanium bathtub aircraft using cables and prayers. Her altitude was bleeding. Her airspeed was critical. And the nearest suitable landing zone was 38 miles away across terrain that didn't forgive mistakes. She checked her instruments out of habit, even though half of them were dead and the other half were lying. Oil pressure 0, hydraulic pressure red, engine temperature beyond what the gauge could display, just a needle pegged at the maximum with nowhere else to go. She did the math in her head, the kind of math pilots do when they're deciding between bad options and worse ones. She could punch out, let the aircraft crater into the desert, and walk away with nothing but bruised pride and a story. Or she could ride it home, keep the bird intact, and maybe, possibly, if everything went right and physics decided to take a coffee break, land this thing in one piece. The radio crackled back to life, weak and full of static but functional. Hawk 7-1, say fuel state and intentions. Mariana keyed the mic, her voice steady despite the vibration rattling through the airframe. Fuel's not the problem. I'm declaring emergency. Setting course for home plate. Tell the crash crew to roll the trucks and maybe say something nice at my funeral if this goes sideways. There was a pause on the other end, then a different voice, older, carrying authority. Gravedigger, this is Tower Actual. We've got the trucks ready and the deck clear. Bring her home. You've done enough for one day. She almost smiled at that. Enough for one day. as if there was a quota for how many lives you could save before you were allowed to quit. She adjusted her trim, such as it was, and pointed the nose toward the distant airfield. The aircraft shuddered, objected, then grudgingly complied. The flight back became a negotiation between gravity and willpower, with Mariana playing mediator. Every mile felt like 10. Every 1,000 feet of altitude loss felt permanent. She talked to the aircraft, quietly, the way you'd talk to a wounded animal you were trying to coax into safety. The A-10 had a reputation for toughness, for absorbing damage that would turn other jets into falling debris, but there were limits to everything. She could feel those limits approaching, could sense them in the way the controls went mushy and unresponsive, in the way the aircraft wanted to nose down and stay down. The enemy had shot her up worse than she'd initially thought. She could see it now, holes in her left wing the size of dinner plates, something trailing from her empennage that might have been part of her tail assembly, and a spray pattern of hydraulic fluid that painted a dotted line across her fuselage. They'd hit her with everything: small arms, heavy machine guns, possibly a rocket-propelled grenade that had detonated close enough to send shrapnel through non-critical systems. Non-critical being relative when you're trying to fly home. She ran through her emergency procedures again, double-checking systems that were already checked, looking for options that didn't exist. The ejection seat was right there, between her legs, a lever pull away from ending this experiment in controlled flight. But ejecting meant leaving the aircraft, and leaving the aircraft meant it would crash somewhere below, possibly onto the small villages that dotted this region, possibly onto friendly forces, possibly into the kind of terrain that would make recovery impossible. She'd seen crashed aircraft before, had walked through wreckage that used to be someone's machine, someone's responsibility. She didn't want this A-10 to become that. The radio crackled with updates. The tower was tracking her, watching her slow descent on radar, calculating intercept points and probability curves. The crash crews were staged. The medical teams were standing by. Everyone was ready for the worst while hopping for something better. Mariana focused on the horizon, on the small details that kept her grounded in the present. The way the sun reflected off her cracked canopy, the smell of smoke that had worked its way into the cockpit despite her oxygen mask, the persistent warning tones that had become background noise, just another voice in the choir of systems failing gracefully. She thought about her father, who'd flown B-52s and had once told her that landing was just controlled falling with style. She thought about her mother, who'd survived 3 deployments by being too stubborn to die and too competent to fail. And she thought about the 40 soldiers below who were still breathing because she'd stayed in the fight when leaving would have been easier. The airfield appeared on the horizon, a strip of concrete and hope surrounded by desert. She was too low, too slow, and still descending. The math wasn't working in her favor. She'd need altitude to make the approach, but gaining altitude required power she didn't have and controls that barely responded. She made her decision in the space between heartbeats, committing to a straightened approach that would give her one chance and no room for error. Tower was talking, feeding her wind conditions and runway status, but she barely heard them. Her world had narrowed to the stick in her hand, the throttle under her palm, and the strip of concrete that was growing larger in her windscreen. The aircraft wanted to spin. It wanted to stall. It wanted to quit. She wouldn't let it. The landing gear came down manually, a hand-pumped system that required 30 pumps of a lever that felt like it was connected to the Earth's core. Her right arm burned. Sweat ran down her back, despite the cold air screaming through the bullet holes in her canopy. The gear locked with a thunk she felt more than heard, 3 green lights confirming what her body already knew through vibration and drag. She was committed now. No going around. No second chances. Just her, the aircraft, and a runway that looked impossibly short and infinitely far away. The desert floor rose to meet her, close enough now that she could see individual rocks and scrub brush. Her airspeed was critical, just above stall, maintained through sheer force of will and the last dregs of engine power. The runway threshold passed beneath her, and she pulled power to idle, flared the nose up, and waited for the inevitable meeting between titanium and concrete. The A-10 hit hard, all 11 tons of it slamming onto the runway with a screech of tortured metal and rubber. The right main gear collapsed immediately, sending the wing tip into the concrete with a spray of sparks that looked like fireworks. The aircraft slewed right, grinding, scraping, hemorrhaging parts and momentum in equal measure. Mariana fought the spin uselessly because the controls were gone and physics was in charge now. The left gear held for 3 seconds, then 4, then gave up and folded, dropping the aircraft onto its belly with a sound like a car wreck happening in slow motion. They slid. 2,000 feet of runway disappeared beneath them in a blur of noise and violence and incredible, impossible deceleration. The nose dug in. The tail came up. For a moment, Mariana thought they might flip, might tumble end over end in a cartwheel of destruction that would make for great crash investigation photos. But the tail settled back down, the nose scraped forward another 100 feet, and then finally, mercifully, they stopped. Silence, real silence. The kind that feels loud after you've been inside a dying aircraft for 40 minutes. Mariana sat in her ejection seat, hands still on the controls, breathing hard through her oxygen mask. Smoke was pouring from both engines now, thick and black and enthusiastic. The fire trucks were already moving, sirens wailing, foam cannons deploying. Someone on the radio was asking if she was okay, if she could move, if she needed immediate extraction. She reached up, unclipped her mask, and keyed the radio one last time. Tower, Hawk 7-1 is down safe. Aircraft is a mess, but I'm walking away. Somebody buy that maintenance crew a beer. They built one hell of a tough bird. Then she popped the canopy, unstrapped, and climbed out onto the wing of her destroyed aircraft. The crash crews were there in seconds, helping her down, checking her for injuries, asking questions she answered automatically while staring at what was left of her A-10. The entire right side was shredded. The left wing had more holes than metal. Both engines were smoking ruins. The landing gear was scattered across 2,000 feet of runway like breadcrumbs. By every reasonable metric, this aircraft should never have made it home. But it had, because she'd refused to let it quit. And maybe, she thought as the adrenaline started to wear off and her hands started to shake, maybe that was enough. The base commander met her at the medical tent, a colonel with 30 years of flight experience and the kind of face that had seen everything twice. He looked at Mariana, then at the wreckage being foamed by fire crews, then back at Mariana. When he spoke, his voice carried something that might have been respect or might have been disbelief. Possibly both. Captain Voss, that was either the bravest flying I've ever witnessed or the most reckless. I'm honestly not sure which. Mariana peeled off her gloves, inspected her hands for damage she couldn't feel, and met his eyes. With respect, sir, I don't think there's a difference. Not when people are counting on you. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, sharp and decisive. The company you supported wants to meet you. 43 soldiers who are going home because you stayed in the fight. They're asking for Gravedigger specifically. She felt something twist in her chest at that, something warm and uncomfortable and entirely unexpected. Tell them I was just doing my job. They know, the colonel said quietly. They want to thank you anyway, take a shower, get checked out by the docs, then go talk to them. They've earned that much. He walked away, leaving her standing outside the medical tent with a destroyed aircraft smoking behind her and a future that suddenly felt a lot more complicated than she'd planned. Because staying in the fight was easy when you were alone in a cockpit, making decisions that affected only yourself. But facing the people you'd saved, seeing their faces, hearing their gratitude, that required a different kind of courage entirely. The medical check took 20 minutes. No broken bones. Minor cuts from shrapnel that had made it through the canopy, bruising across her shoulders from the harness during the crash landing. The flight surgeon cleared her with instructions to rest, hydrate, and probably consider therapy at some point because landing a flaming aircraft on one engine and no hydraulics wasn't standard procedure for mental health. She found the infantry company in the chow hall, still in their combat gear, faces streaked with dust and exhaustion. They saw her coming and stood as one, 43 soldiers rising in a wave of respect that made her stop in the doorway. The captain she'd been supporting stepped forward, younger than his rank suggested, with eyes that had seen too much and were grateful to see more. "Captain Voss," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on her name. "I'm Captain Rivera, Groundhog Actual. You saved my company, all of us. We were dead without you." Mariana didn't know what to say to that. She'd rehearsed a dozen responses on the walk over, but standing here, facing these soldiers who wore their survival like a second skin, the words evaporated. So she said the only thing that felt true. "You would have done the same." Rivera smiled at that, tired and genuine. "Maybe, but you did it while on fire. That takes something special." The soldiers began approaching then, one by one, shaking her hand, offering thanks that ranged from eloquent to profane. A sergeant with a combat patch and 3 deployments worth of experience gripped her hand hard enough to hurt and said nothing, just nodded once with eyes that understood. A specialist who couldn't have been more than 22 hugged her quickly, whispered thank you against her shoulder, and walked away before she could respond. By the end of it, Mariana's hand hurt from shaking and her chest felt tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. These were warriors, professional soldiers who dealt in violence and risk, and they were thanking her. Not because she'd done something extraordinary, but because she'd been there when they needed her most. Because she hadn't quit when quitting was reasonable. Because she'd made a choice and followed through, consequences be damned. Later that night, lying in her bunk with the sounds of the base settling into evening routine around her, Mariana thought about the flight, about the decisions made in milliseconds, the calculations done on instinct, the moment when she'd chosen to stay instead of leaving. She thought about her destroyed A-10, about the maintenance crews who would spend weeks cataloging every hole and failure, about the investigation board that would want detailed explanations for choices made at 300 knots with an engine on fire. She thought about the 43 soldiers who were writing letters home tonight, making phone calls, planning futures that almost didn't exist. And she realized something that she'd always known intellectually, but was now understanding in her bones. Flying wasn't about the aircraft or the missions or the glory of combat. It was about the people depending on you. It was about showing up when the stakes were highest and doing the job regardless of cost. Her call sign, Gravedigger, took on new weight that night. Not because she'd buried enemies, though she had, but because she'd prevented graves from being dug for friends. And maybe, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, that was the only legacy that mattered. The investigation board convened 3 days later in a conference room that smelled like burned coffee and bureaucratic necessity. 5 officers sat across from Mariana, flanked by recorders and legal advisors, their faces carefully neutral as they reviewed her written statement for the 3rd time. The senior officer, a brigadier general with combat wings and a reputation for fairness, looked up from the document and studied her with the intensity of someone evaluating aircraft performance metrics. "Captain Voss," he began, his voice carrying the weight of both rank and experience, "walk us through your decision to continue engaging enemy targets after your aircraft sustained catastrophic damage. Specifically, the moment when you lost hydraulic pressure and electrical systems, but chose to remain in the fight rather than egress to a safe landing zone." Mariana had prepared for this question. She'd known it was coming from the moment her wheels touched concrete and the crash crews had surrounded her aircraft. In aviation, there were rules, procedures, carefully calculated risk matrices that determine when you pressed forward and when you pulled back. She'd violated most of them by choosing to stay in the fight, and now she had to explain why breaking rules designed to keep pilots alive had been the right call. She met the general's eyes and spoke with the calm certainty of someone who'd already second-guessed every decision and arrived at the same conclusion. "Sir," At the time of hydraulic failure, I assessed that immediate egress would leave friendly forces without close air support during a critical phase of enemy contact. The F-16s had exhausted ordnance. The Apache were grounded. I had functional weapons, visual contact with targets, and sufficient control authority to complete one additional gun run. The tactical situation demanded action, not preservation of assets. The general leaned back in his chair, exchanging glances with the other board members. You're aware that Air Force doctrine strongly discourages continuing combat operations in a severely damaged aircraft. The risk to the pilot, the risk of losing the asset, the potential for crash landing in contested territory. These factors typically mandate immediate withdrawal. Yes, sir, I'm aware. Yet you chose to ignore that doctrine. I chose to prioritize mission completion over personal safety, sir. The asset, my aircraft, was already combat ineffective for extended operations, but it still had one good gun run left, and that run meant the difference between 43 casualties and 43 soldiers going home. I made a tactical assessment that the mission value exceeded the risk. One of the other officers, a colonel with more administrative ribbons than combat decorations, leaned forward with the expression of someone preparing to make a point. Captain, this board isn't questioning your courage, but courage without judgment is recklessness. You could have ejected. You could have crashed. You could have become a prisoner of war or a casualty yourself. How do you justify taking those risks when your primary duty is to preserve Air Force assets and personnel, which includes yourself? The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. Mariana considered it carefully, knowing that her answer would determine whether she walked out of this room with a medal or a reprimand, possibly both. The truth was complicated, nuanced, existing in the gray space between black and white regulations, but the truth was all she had. Sir, I justify it because those soldiers were counting on me. Not on the Air Force, not on doctrine, but on me specifically. When you accept the responsibility of close air support, you become part of the ground commander's plan. You become a factor in calculations about risk and movement and survival. Those soldiers made decisions, exposed themselves, held positions, trusted in fire support, based on my presence. Leaving would have invalidated their trust and potentially cost lives that my continued presence could save. In that moment, the value of one pilot and one aircraft was less than the value of 43 lives. The math was clear. The room fell silent. The recorders kept recording. The legal advisors scribbled notes. And the general sat back with an expression that might have been approval or might have been resignation to the reality that some pilots would always choose the mission over the manual. Finally, he spoke, and his voice had softened just slightly. Captain Voss, this board finds that while your actions violated standard operating procedures and placed Air Force assets at unnecessary risk, they were undertaken in good faith with full awareness of consequences and resulted in significant tactical success with minimal loss of life. You will be formally counseled regarding adherence to doctrine. You will also be recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight under combat conditions. Dismissed. Mariana stood, saluted, and walked out of the conference room with a strange mixture of relief and frustration. She'd been vindicated and reprimanded simultaneously, celebrated and cautioned. It was the military way, acknowledging that rules existed for good reasons but sometimes had to bend for better ones. The Distinguished Flying Cross would join the others on her dress uniform, another ribbon in a growing collection that told the story of a career spent pushing boundaries and bringing people home. Word spread through the base faster than official channels could manage. By evening, everyone knew about Gravedigger's board hearing, about her medal recommendation, about the way she defended her actions with logic that left the brass with nothing to say except, "Don't do it again." The younger pilots sought her out, asking questions about decision-making under pressure, about how you knew when to follow rules and when to trust instinct. She answered honestly without bravado, explaining that every situation was different and the only constant was consequence. You owned your choices, whatever came after. The maintenance crews finished their assessment of her A-10 2 days later. The aircraft had sustained over 200 impacts from small arms fire, 17 hits from heavy machine guns, and one rocket-propelled grenade proximity detonation that had shredded control surfaces and severed hydraulic lines. Both engines were complete losses. The landing gear was destroyed. The wings would need to be replaced. By any reasonable standard, the aircraft should have fallen out of the sky within minutes of the initial damage. That it had remained flyable for 40 additional minutes and completed 2 more gun runs before limping home was testament to both the A-10's legendary durability and Mariana's skill at coaxing performance from a dying machine. They wouldn't repair it. The damage was too extensive, the cost too high. Instead, they'd strip it for parts, salvage what could be saved, and eventually cut up the rest for scrap metal. The shovel painted on its nose, the small symbol that had earned her the call sign Gravedigger, would disappear into history. Another aircraft lost to combat, another serial number added to the ledger of machines that gave everything in service of something larger. Mariana visited the aircraft one last time before they towed it away to the salvage yard. It sat on the far side of the flight line, covered in tarps and tagged with red X's that declared it beyond flight status, a ghost of the weapon it had been. She walked around it slowly, running her hand along fuselage still marked with scorch patterns and torn metal, remembering how it had felt in that final approach when nothing was working and everything was failing, but the aircraft had somehow held together long enough to matter. "Hell of a bird," someone said behind her. She turned to find the crew chief who'd maintained this specific A-10 for the last 8 months, a master sergeant with 30 years of keeping warplanes flying and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too many come home broken. "I've worked on hundreds of aircraft. Never seen one take this much punishment and still land. She brought you home, Captain. That's what they're built for." "She brought everyone home," Mariana corrected quietly. "I just helped steer." The master sergeant smiled at that, understanding passing between them without need for elaboration. "For what it's worth, the maintenance crews are proud. This aircraft did exactly what the designers intended, protected the pilot, absorbed damage, and completed the mission. We talk about the A-10 being tough, but this one proved it. This one's going in the history books." They stood together in comfortable silence, two professionals who understood that aircraft were more than metal and hydraulics. They were partners, tools, and trusted allies, machines that kept faith with the people who flew and maintained them. This particular had kept that faith to the absolute limit of its structural integrity, and now it would rest, its service complete, its legacy secured. When they finally towed it away, Mariana didn't watch. She'd already said her goodbyes, already made peace with the reality that combat consumed machines as surely as it consumed ammunition. But she kept the small patch that someone had peeled from the canopy rail, the one with the shovel insignia and the words "Gravedigger's Ride," stitched in thread that had survived fire and shrapnel. It would go in her locker, a reminder of the day when everything went wrong and somehow turned out right anyway. The weeks that followed settled into routine with the uncomfortable ease of military life reasserting normalcy after chaos. Mariana flew again, assigned a new A-10 that handled better and complained less but somehow felt wrong, like wearing someone else's boots. She completed her missions professionally, supported ground forces competently, and returned to base without incident. The other pilots treated her differently now, not with mockery or dismissal, but with the careful respect reserved for someone who'd proven themselves in ways that couldn't be argued or diminished. They asked her opinion in briefings. They listened when she spoke. They stopped questioning whether she belonged in the cockpit and started accepting that she'd earned her place through fire. The Distinguished Flying Cross arrived in a ceremony attended by the wing commander and half the base. They pinned it on her uniform while reading citations that described her actions in language so formal it barely resembled the reality of flying a burning aircraft through hostile fire. She stood at attention, accepted congratulations from officers who outranked her by decades, and felt the weight of expectation settling onto shoulders that already carried enough. Because medals meant something in the military, they marked you as someone who'd exceeded standards, who'd done what others couldn't or wouldn't, who'd become an example for younger service members to aspire toward. She hadn't asked for that responsibility, hadn't wanted to be held up as proof that determination could overcome physics or that staying in the fight was always the right answer. But the choice wasn't hers anymore. Her story had become property of the Air Force, retold in training sessions and professional development courses, distilled into lessons about courage and decision-making, and the difference between acceptable risk and suicide mission. The infantry company she'd supported sent her a plaque, a heavy wooden thing with 43 signatures and a message etched in brass. "To Gravedigger, you gave us tomorrow. We won't forget." It hung in her quarters now, next to her flight suit and above her boots, a tangible reminder that aviation wasn't about flying. It was about the people depending on you to show up when the world turned hostile and options ran thin. Every time she looked at it, she remembered Rivera's voice on the radio, remembered the sound of men praying in Spanish while waiting for air support that might not come, remembered the weight of knowing that her choices would determine whether names went on memorial walls or birth certificates. That weight never lightened. She just learned to carry it differently, the way you learn to carry any burden that becomes permanent. Some nights she dreamed about the flight, reliving those 40 minutes when systems failed and fire spread, and the only thing standing between catastrophe and survival was her refusal to quit. She'd wake with her heart racing, hands gripping sheets like control sticks, and have to remind herself that she'd made it, that everyone had made it, that the story had ended with wheels on concrete instead of wreckage in desert sand. The nightmares were normal, the flight surgeon assured her. Post-traumatic stress manifesting in subconscious replay of high-intensity events. He offered therapy, medication, time off. She declined them all, not because she thought herself invulnerable, but because she understood that some things couldn't be fixed with treatment. Some memories were meant to stay sharp, to remind you of stakes and consequences, to keep you honest when the next crisis demanded decisions made in milliseconds with insufficient information. She flew her missions. She brought her aircraft home. And slowly, gradually, the Air Force moved on to other stories, other heroes, other examples of courage under fire. The legend of Gravedigger faded into the background noise of military lore, another tale told in ready rooms and classrooms, impressive but distant, divorced from the woman who lived it. Mariana preferred it that way. She'd never wanted fame or recognition. She'd wanted to fly, to serve, to make a difference in ways that mattered beyond personal achievement. The Distinguished Flying Cross would sit in a drawer somewhere after she retired, alongside campaign ribbons and qualification badges, and all the other symbols that translated decades of service into inches of colored fabric. But the plaque from Rivera's company would stay on her wall, would follow her from base to base, would remind her on difficult days why she'd chosen this life and what it meant to honor that choice. Years later, long after the deployment ended and the war moved to different theaters with different enemies, someone would ask her about that flight, about the decision to stay when leaving was safer, about the calculation that valued mission over self-preservation, about what it felt like to land a dying aircraft while trailing fire and fighting for every second of controlled flight. She'd pause, considering her words carefully, aware that her answer would become part of the story that outlived the reality. And she'd say, simply and honestly, what she'd always known to be true. It felt like what I'd trained for, like the moment when all the practice and preparation and doubt collapsed into action. You don't think about being brave or reckless. You don't calculate your legacy or worry about medals. You just do the job in front of you with the tools you have for the people counting on you. Everything else is noise. And in that answer, delivered without theatrics or false humility, would be the essence of what it meant to be Gravedigger, a pilot who understood that heroism wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic sacrifice. It was about showing up, staying present, and refusing to quit when quitting was the easier path. It was about the radio going quiet, then her A-10 appearing low over the ridge, burning but fighting, impossible but real, carrying with it the promise that sometimes, when everything falls apart, someone will hold the line anyway. That promise mattered. It mattered to the 43 soldiers who went home. It mattered to the pilots who came after, who learned from her example and carried it forward into their own moments of crisis. And it mattered to Mariana herself, who discovered through fire and smoke and impossible odds that the person she'd always hoped to be in an emergency was exactly who she turned out to be when tested. The rest was just details, just the mechanics of flight and the physics of damage and the administrative aftermath of breaking rules for good reasons. The core truth remained unchanged and unchallengeable. When the radio went quiet and hope seemed lost, she'd appeared over that ridge, burning but fighting, damaged but determined, exactly where she needed to be, exactly when it mattered most. And that, in the end, was the only story worth telling.